Mainstream media is coming in hot with their responses to Tucker Carlson's interview with Russian President Vladimir Putin, aired last week. One CNN headline read, "Putin walks away with propaganda victory after Tucker Carlson's softball interview." CNN wrote, over the course of the more than 2-hour sit-down, the former Fox News host turned online commentator largely refrained from challenging the Russian authoritarian whose brutal war on Ukraine has led to the needless deaths of hundreds of thousands of people.
The article continued, instead of pressing Putin on the many topics at hand, including credible accusations Russia has committed war crimes and the imprisonment of opposition leader Alexei Navalny, Carlson allowed the autocrat a free lane to manipulate the public and tell his version of history, no matter how deceptive it may have been. MSNBC also chimed in, writing, Tucker Carlson just gave Vladimir Putin exactly what he wanted. Putin is a former KGB officer. That means he's a master at manipulating and exploiting events for desired outcomes. All right, so look, here's what is true and what I said going into this interview, that doing the interview is not a bad idea. However, when you are in a situation where you have a really important guest and it's a very high-profile interview, you have to be so prepared so that you don't become the exploited party in the interview. And right off the bat, knowing who Putin is, knowing how smart he is, knowing what his background is, he clearly has the upper hand in a situation like this with Tucker Carlson. I wouldn't want to do this because I'm not an expert in Russian history. I'm not an expert in geopolitical history. I would feel out of my depth in this situation. Anybody can get up to speed. I believe in Tucker's capacity. I believe in my capacity. But you have to put it and do the work. And although I think a lot of the liberal hand-wringing about this interview is coming from a place of bias, the critique that Tucker was out of his depth at times in this interview and was not able to effectively get Putin to answer specific questions that were more clarifying than obscuring is a true critique.
I think so too, but I would say some interesting stuff came out of this anyway, and the headlines being that this is the worst thing that's ever happened. I mean, they're so condemning. They talk about this like this was the worst thing that has ever happened in human history, is Tucker Carlson talking to Vladimir Putin. I learned some interesting things. At one point, Tucker Carlson said, Vladimir Putin says, you know, let's have peace. I want peace. And Tucker says, like, okay, call Joe Biden right now. Let's make peace. And then Putin's like, well, no. We end the military aid, and then it will be over, and then we'll see. Like, okay, well, so that's not what you just said. But look, also, we do have to remember the mainstream media interviews Zelensky all the time. We get to hear from Zelensky all the time. I would say a lot of those interviews include very little pushback. So there's some kind of implicit framing here in that what Putin is saying, that I want you to stop arming Ukraine, is de facto wrong. So him saying it, it's like you're not supposed to hear him saying that because that position is wrong. Now, that's not how a lot of the American people feel. It's not how many of the Republican Party members feel. They have questions whether this continued funding is good. And so I think it was helpful to hear that perspective. And in some of this comment, I was particularly struck by the Washington Post commentary on this. Here's a paragraph in the Washington Post just slamming this interview. Putin also told Carlson that a main reason for the invasion and one of Moscow's continuing chief goals is the denazification of Ukraine, part of Putin's continuing false allegation that Kiev is controlled by Nazis. Ukraine, and now this is just a claim they're making in this Washington Post article. Ukraine is a democracy, and Zelensky, who was overwhelmingly elected president in 2019, is of Jewish descent, as are other top officials. Putin's real goal, many analysts say, is to oust Zelensky in favor of a Russian puppet regime. Look, Ukraine is sort of a democracy. They've suspended opposition parties. They've just suspended opposition media. I do not think Zelensky is not a Nazi and top officials are not Nazis, but there are, in fact, Nazi battalions that are part of like, that's just true. It's uncomfortable. Mainstream media hates when you point it out, but it is, in fact, true. Putin says his goal is not the overthrow of the entire country, but a return of these disputed territories. Now, you can say he's lying. That's not true, but we've heard from Zelensky's perspective. Why should we not also hear Putin's perspective on the conflict so that we can make an informed judgment as taxpayers for what we're going to fund here?
And Putin specifically spoke to the story we covered where Canada awarded this big award to a Nazi and had to retract it. Specifically alluded to Zelensky visiting Nazi Azov, Italian troops in Ukraine. And instead of engaging with those pointed and legitimate criticisms, even to the extent of saying there are some Nazis in Ukraine, but they are not the overwhelming gist, and we still think that even that's a legitimate goal, that's a pretext for actions that are not appropriate or validated by the laws of war. I mean, you could say something like that, but they go so far in the opposite direction. I agree, they end up kind of, frankly, making themselves look like such unreliable critics that some of the things that I think Putin should be offer some pushback on just could go unanalyzed. So Putin also talked about, in addition to the denazification argument, the Nord Stream pipeline. Tucker asked him, well, who do you think blew up the Nord Stream pipeline? And, you know, Putin is good. He's a KGB. He's able to slip and slide out of some of this. There's the translation delay that I think made it not the easiest job for Tucker as well. Maybe it would be nice to have someone interview him in Russian. There's plenty of Americans that speak Russian and are also journalists. That seems like a good way to go. But he said, well, look, you have to have a confluence of ability and interest in doing something like that. There are a lot of people who might have an interest in blowing up the pipeline, not so many that have the ability. And basically, what do you think? It was an interesting exchange. He denied the idea that he is endeavoring to start some kind of global war and conquer all of Europe, which has very much been the line out of the West. He says it doesn't make any sense. Tucker asked him, is there a world where we could see you like invading Poland? He said, what interest do I have in invading Poland? What interest do I have in starting World War III? People have been saying about Russia for years that we have nuclear bombs. We're going to drop nuclear bombs. What interest do I have in this? And why aren't these accusations basically being made to other nuclear powers? And on and on and on. So it is a shame to not be able to have the perspective of the fact that this was a wholesome, like a holistic interview that touched on a number of subjects that, frankly, are not conversations that are brought up with our allies, as you pointed out with Zelensky. And the read that we just had, where somebody mentioned, you know, why isn't he being challenged on war crimes that he's perpetrated in Ukraine? It springs to mind immediately that why, when Netanyahu is doing mainstream interviews, is he's not being challenged on war crimes, especially since we have the highest international court weighing in to say that not just any old war crime, but genocide is plausible in Gaza. I mean, the double standard, again, is just such that it really undermines the value of the mainstream media. Yeah, and look, again, you can say that he's wrong. I don't, you know, you can conclude after listening to this, I don't believe Vladimir Putin. Yeah. I do think he has imperial ambitions. Sure. This war is unjustified, and he's trying to get us to not give any more weapons, and then I think he's going to invade the whole country. Like, you can still reach that conclusion if you want, but I don't know, it doesn't seem fair. In fact, it seems a little propagandistic to say you should be shielded from this perspective, but you should uncritically receive the Zelensky perspective at every turn. Yeah. It doesn't make any sense to me. So I thought it was pretty interesting. And you know, and then in fairer recaps of what happened, or what went on in the interview, like I saw, you know, Slate had a headline that was everything that was wrong with Tucker Carlson's Putin interview, and it was, you know, very critical. But they do acknowledge that when he's talking about the history of NATO and that there is, you know, some of it was exaggerated on the Putin part, how aggrieved he is over the NATO stuff, but that some of it was accurate, describing that NATO membership said it was never going to happen, then it was offered, then it was, you know, that whole kind of history of how things went down from Clinton and then Bush in a way that made Russia feel boxed in. So anyway, I thought it was interesting after all, and certainly not something that you would be cover your ears so that you don't hear this. You've got to let people decide for themselves at some point. I think it's fair to say there should have been more pushback. Frankly, he just went on and on at the beginning. It was hard to get a word in, and because of the translation issues, I think it was a daunting task. Yeah. But I found it interesting. Well, big numbers for Tucker Carlson with this, along with a lot of his other interviews. Certainly, it does seem to be modeling a avenue for success for alternative media. He is able to get these big interviews, and a lot of people are tuning in, even if the mainstream news coverage is not so fond of that reality. So let us know what you think in the comments, and stick around. We have more Rising for you coming up next.